Hello, everyone. Today we will be covering the Queen's Gambit declined. Do any of you out there play the Queen's Gambit? I did have a viewer who mentioned that they played the Queen's Gambit, but they weren't sure what to play against the Queen's Gambit declined. So I'll go over a game today, and we see that the ratings are, let's see, white was played by Ray Robson, 2633 rating, versus another 2600 rated player, Martin Kravitsev. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. But white played at a 2800 level versus black's 2550. Now, here's an interesting point for all of those that like to memorize openings. It looks like White's opening accuracy was 97.8, but his opponent played 99.8% accuracy in the opening, so an almost perfect opening. So perhaps he had a lot of opening theory memorized, but the higher rated player ended up winning in the middle game and end game, which was middle game 94.8 for white and 92.5 for black, and then the end game 91.5 for white and 81.6. So that just shows you that it's not always best to just memorize openings and opening theory. You must also practice your middle game strategy and tactics, and brush up on the end games as well, because the middle game and the end game a lot of time can determine the outcome of the game. All right, well, let's take a look here. Percentage accuracy 93.6 for white and 88.4 for black. Looks like they both had 3 inaccuracies, but the winner only made 1 mistake versus black's 3 mistakes, which lost the game. Okay, this game began with c4. So normally the Queen's Gambit is d4, d5, and then c4. But openings can start out one way and then transpose into what the opponent or what you want to play. So here, now they reached the Queen's Gambit declined, but it was just a little different move order. So that's something to be aware of when you're studying an opening. Kind of go through a lot of games and look out for possible transpositions where the move order is slightly off, because that can sometimes throw somebody off. You could have difficulties if you kind of think you're going into one opening and it kind of veers off into something you're unfamiliar with. All right, so if we look at the position now, and this Queen's Gambit declined, we notice that there's a fight here for d5. So the c pawn has pushed forward to attack this pawn in the center. Black has defended it with the e pawn and the knight, and white has also brought his knight up to attack it. And so the game immediately continues with white just pressing forward with his attack here. So the gambit was declined and black did not capture the c pawn, so white instead uses that less valuable c pawn to capture a more valuable central pawn. And so black recaptures, keeping the pawns even here on d4 and d5, but now white is left with 2 central pawns to black's 1, so that could be an advantage. And let's see how the game continues. So bishop to g5, pinning the knight to the queen. And so that's ignored by black, and he pushes up here c6 to help fortify this d pawn. That way, if the bishop captures the knight, this pawn will still be protected here if the queen decides to recapture the knight. All right, so Now white plays e3, fortifying his central pawn and giving room for his bishop to be developed. And the game continues with the bishop move here, which is quite common to break this pin of the knight here on the queen. And so now white just continues development, putting this bishop on a central outpost here where it can aim up through the center and over to the king side. And so now another common move in the queen's gambit where the knight moves here to d7 and just fortifies this knight on f6. So now if the knight is captured, this other knight can recapture. All right, knight to f3. So if we look at the position, everybody is just developing their pieces, and all the pieces are putting pressure, especially white, on the center here, trying to keep control and lock down the center. And black continues with castling, white does the same, and finally a piece moves twice in the opening. And generally you don't want to do that, but black is a little more cramped, and he decided to try and trade off material. So if you're in a cramped position, we see how his knight is here blocking in his bishop. By jumping forward here, now the bishop is under attack by the knight, the bishop, the queen, and it's only protected by the knight here. So white must act immediately and is kind of forced here to make a move to either exchange off queens, but here he refuses to do that and he just retreats this bishop. And it says that this is the best move according to the computer. So white is trying to keep his bishop pair, which is usually an advantage to keep the bishop pair because you have one light and one dark squared bishop that controls all colors, both colors of the squares on the board. Whereas once one of your bishops is traded off, well, then it might be a little bit harder to cover the squares of that bishop that has been captured. All right, so black presses forward, knight to f6, reinforcing his other knight here on e4. And now we have h3. So this move does a few things. It allows the bishop to retreat back here. Later in the endgame, it could allow some space for the king to escape up to h2. It also prevents this bishop from developing here and pinning the knight to the queen. All right, so now we have bishop to f5, reinforcing this knight here, developing the bishop, possibly allowing this bishop to move back, or the queen to reinforce it, and then trying to trade off this good bishop for black's bad bishop. So I've mentioned that before about good bishops and bad bishops, and what that is, for those that don't know, a good bishop, like this bishop here on d3, is on the opposite colored squares of the central pawns. So we see that this bad bishop is limited by these pawns. They're kind of blocking the path of this bishop. So the same here, this light squared bishop for black is kind of blocked a little bit because of these pawns on the light squares. So it's usually to your advantage to trade off your bad bishop. So black wants to trade off this light squared bishop for white's light squared bishop. And then he would be left with a good bishop and white would be left with a bad bishop. All right, so immediately white strikes out here, pushing a pawn, attacking the bishop, and the computer said that the best move would be just to keep developing, pushing the queen here to c2, a common move in the queen's gambit, and creating a battery up through the middle, even all the way towards the king side. So here we have knight captures, and after a recapture, well, now we have further trading of the pieces. So black has succeeded in trading off some material, giving him more room for the pieces that he has left over. And he's also gotten rid of white's good bishop for black's bad bishop. But white is slightly ahead in space on the king side, and he's a little ahead in development. All he has to do is find out where to put his rooks, whereas black still has to develop his queen and his rooks as well. So moving on, we have queen to c8. So, what is black planning here? Perhaps he is aiming at these pawns down here on the king side. So one possibility may be to push this forward, maybe trying to snatch up this pawn here on h3 if this g pawn moves. Anyway, let's see what happens next. So the king moves up here to help protect this h3 pawn, and then we have b5 being played. So black attempts to just gain some more space on the queen side, although the computer prefers queen to e6, which develops the queen towards the center of the board, and it connects the rooks. So connecting your rooks is usually an advantage, because then the rooks can protect each other, and it gives the rooks more room to slide back and forth on the back rank and move to wherever there's either a half open file, an open file, or if there's none of that, you can move behind pawns that you've pushed forward to help protect them as they move up the board. So white decides to try and gather space on the queen side, and also perhaps to get rid of this isolated pawn, which can be weak here, and perhaps open up this file for his rook on a1. All right, so a6, just reinforcing the pawn, and now we have the bishop move here, putting pressure on the knight. And also, if this knight tries to jump in here to e4, the bishop would be captured. So rook to e8, protecting this unprotected bishop. And that is another important point. Throughout a chess game, if you see an unprotected piece, so if we go back here, right now this bishop is unprotected. So a lot of times, if you see an unprotected piece, see if there's any way you can take advantage of trying to attack that piece or put pressure on that unprotected piece. So here, white took advantage by pinning the knight to this bishop. So the knight wants to jump to this good outpost here on e4, which would be a great spot for this knight to move up the board, down here on white's side of the board, and control a lot of central squares and areas around the king. So we see by going bishop to g5, the knight can't move, or the bishop would just snatch up this unprotected piece. All right, so the rook protects the bishop. So white decides to trade off his bishop, which was a bad bishop anyway, for this knight before it has a chance to jump down here into the center of white's position. So recapture by the bishop, and now white moves a rook up here, which is interesting. The computer says that this is the best move, and the game is dead even right now. So moving on, this rook gets off of the A file. That way, if white captures and black would want to recapture towards the center, it would prevent exchanging off of a pair of rooks here. So if you're going to try and go for the win, you don't want to exchange off too much material, or you just won't have enough in the end game, possibly, to press an advantage. It becomes harder. So this was probably to avoid an exchange, although it looks like g6 would be the preferred move, which would allow the bishop to jump back here to g7, perhaps. So after capture, black decides to capture away from the center. Generally, you want to capture towards the center. But by doing this, now black has a passed pawn here on the A file with nothing to stop it other than white's pieces. This C pawn can slow down the B pawn here. But it looks like this was the best move. And another advantage here for black is that capturing away from the center, even though the general rule is capture with your pawns towards the center, but sometimes there are exceptions to the rule. This move also left white with a backward pawn here on a half open file. And so this is a pretty heavy weakness here that black can start targeting. Maybe if he can get a rook in here and line up all his rooks and queen, creating a battery on this pawn here. All right, so now we have rook at f to a1, a mistake by white. But apparently that was the only mistake he made in the game. Let's take a look and see why that was a mistake. Well, now, if we go back one, right now the game is plus almost half a pawn's worth of material in white's favor. But after this move, the game swings back to negative 0.38 in black's favor. So why does this move cause problems? Well, let's see. First of all, what the computer recommended. The computer recommends instead of that rook move, queen to f5, which if if black captures, well then we just trade off queens. The game probably heads closer to a draw, but it would leave white with some doubled pawns here on the f file. Although it may be a little difficult to get at that pawn. The king could try and move forward and run up here to try and protect the pawn, possibly. But, black wants to go for the win and avoid the exchange of queens. Black could just go after this unprotected pawn, but then white would be able to capture either the D pawn or the A pawn if the queen would go after this pawn. So the computer does recommend that black avoid going after the pawns and just remaneuver the queen over to the B7 square where it can protect this A6 pawn and the central pawn here. And then what is the queen doing sitting here on f5? It's close to the king side, but I don't know. It just remains to be seen what white will do next to try and use this queen to some advantage now that it's moved up to f5. All right, so if we look at this move, rook at f to a1, well, it looks like he's piling up here on this a6 pawn. And now this is the best move to be played. Black just repositions the rook down here. He doesn't want to go here behind the pawn because if he goes behind the pawn, there are only two squares that he can go to back and forth. A7 and A8, but the rook moving to the side of this pawn to protect it is a little more flexible because now he has this whole sixth rank that he can move to. Well, if the bishop gets out of the way, he could even move over here to the king side. But it just gives this rook more flexibility here. And so now black is in the lead. The queen does move up here, attempting to put pressure on the queen. But now it says that that's not the best move. That queen to e2 would have been a better move. So that's interesting, because then it just tempts the queen to run down here and capture this pawn for free. So black does capture, which is a mistake, and now the game jumps to +1 in favor of white here. So once again, it looked like queen to b7 would have been the best move. But after capture of the queens, white recaptures, and then the game continues with the other rook being forced to jump in behind here to protect this pawn. But now this rook is pretty limited here, but he had to move there to protect the pawn from these two rooks. And moving on, we have knight to e1, the best move, repositioning this knight where it could possibly jump up to d3 and then jump up to c5 here, putting even more pressure on this pawn. So we have the bishop jumping in here, the knight jumps up to the center, and here the bishop is ready to capture the knight if it jumps into this c5 square. So the bishop just keeps repositioning here closer to the center, where it has control of these two diagonals on either side of the board. And so the knight now jumps over here to b4 to put more pressure on this pawn. So black is pretty much forced to capture. And after an exchange, now white no longer has a backward pawn, but he does have an isolated pawn. So as you're playing chess, a lot of times you may be able to create a weakness on your opponent's side of the board. Well, then let's say you attack that weakness, but you can't break through and you can't take advantage of it. There may be a way to keep playing and transform one weakness into another. So we see that black had a weakness here of this pawn, a backward pawn on c5, but he didn't take advantage of that. But after the trade here, now white has another weakness, this isolated pawn. Although this pawn here does help prevent the push of this a pawn, which cannot be done anyway at this point because the two rooks are guarding this a5 square. All right, moving on. g6 is played, attacking this pawn. So, of course, white just gets rid of this doubled pawn. And now we have a recapture towards the center, which could allow the king to try and come down here, or a rook later to put pressure on this isolated pawn on h3. And the game continues with rook to c1. White jumping over here to take control of this open file. The rook could jump up here, maybe put pressure on this d pawn, even jump up here on the 7th rank. And now we have rook to d6 here. So just protecting this d pawn before white even comes up here to attack it. Well, now white sees that that pawn's protected. He just jumps up to the 7th rank, and then he can prepare to move his other rook over and double rooks, because usually rooks are stronger when you double them up, where they can reinforce each other. They can help protect each other, and they can put even more pressure on whatever they attack using both the rooks instead of one. So rook to e8, just moving over here, preparing to reposition this rook, maybe to e6. to protect this A pawn if the white rook decides to go over here behind it. And usually it's a good idea to put your rooks behind pawns, whether it's your pawns that you're trying to press forward or behind your opponent's pawns to try and attack them. Now, doubling of the rooks, and black does the same, doubling them on a rank, as opposed to white's doubling on the file here. So now we have king to g3, and remember, when the game goes down into the chess endgame, it's usually a great idea to get your king involved, unless there are still too many pieces on the board, especially queens, where it can be dangerous for the king. But in general, once the queens have been removed from the board and there's not a lot of attacking pieces, here there are just rooks on the board, a lot of times you want to get your king involved in the action. So black does the same, moving his king up, and now we have h4, white trying to gather some space here, potentially maybe get rid of this weak isolated pawn on h4, and now the rook swings over here, limiting the mobility of the king, kind of blocking white's king off, and putting a little bit of pressure on this f pawn perhaps. So now we have the rook jumping up here to this outpost, where if this pawn moves forward, he has the option of capturing the b pawn, or just capturing with the b pawn, picking off this a pawn if it decides to move forward, and having a passed pawn of his own. So the king moves up to h6. So this is a mistake. It looks like the computer instead prefers this move, rook at f to e6 here. And it says that that's the best move. And then the game would continue possibly something like this, moving behind this pawn, and then the rook repositions up here, and white doubling on the 7th rank, threatening to pick off this f pawn. So rook to f6, protecting the pawn, also cutting off the king here, and now white jumps in here behind this unprotected pawn. And so now, a lot of times, and this can be difficult for beginners, you want to, or you're tempted to protect everything with your rooks. You want to protect your pawns and play defense, but usually the winner in a rook endgame will be the person with the most active rooks. Instead of playing defense, it's better to counterattack. So we see that white has 2 strong rooks here, and he attacks this unprotected d pawn. So instead of trying to protect that, maybe with rook to f5, black instead activates one of his own rooks, moving it over here where it can jump down here and attack this unprotected b4 pawn. So this is how the game could continue. This is not what happened in the game. I'll just give you an idea. So white could try and stop the rook from jumping down here. Then after a trade, white has control of this open c file. And now this rook can move here and protect the unprotected d pawn. And the game could continue something like this, with just a lot of maneuvering. And perhaps the game would just end in a draw here. Although, the computer says that white would be in the lead. So this is one way the game could have played out. But in the game, after this position, king to h6 was played, a mistake. And now the game is plus 1.65 in white's favor. And so white plays the best move, rook to e7 here, where he could try and jump down here and have both rooks attacking this D pawn. And so now the best move played by black is defense here, protecting this D5 pawn. And now white just moves up here, limiting black's scope on the king side, gaining space. And now the king decides to move back and try and protect his pawn in case one of his rooks gets traded off. Maybe also black was worried about having his king trapped on the edge of the board. But anyway, he moves back here to try and reposition closer to the center of the board. And now we have this move, an inaccuracy by white. It looks like king to g4 would have been best, just moving forward. But white is still in the lead, +1, almost 1.5. All right, so capture towards the center, attacking the rook. The rook must move back. And so he moves to the best square here, keeping an eye on the d5 pawn, and also protecting this rank here. So if he wants to push forward, white would not be able to jump up here and pin this pawn to the king. So white just moves up here, attacking this unprotected pawn. And now we have black swinging over here, playing defense. White activates his rook, attacking this unprotected pawn. But this does give black the opportunity to activate his rook now on this open file. So the game continues with capture. The rook moves down here to attack this unprotected b pawn. And now rook to d6, moving up, attacking another unprotected pawn. So black captures, white captures, and now black, who is in front of this pawn, moves as far away as possible, where he could also possibly check the white king from behind if that becomes necessary. But by moving all the way up, he's still protecting this pawn, but he can start marching this pawn up the board. So the rook jumps back here, pinning this pawn to the king. And so now the king maneuvers up, and then we have the rook moving behind the passed pawn. So this is an important theme to remember. The rooks, when you're going to attack pawns, it's usually best to get behind them, attack them from the back. If you can't do that, then second best is to get beside the pawns and attack them. And as a last resort, get in front of them. So here black is forced to get in front of his pawn to protect it. Best would have been behind. If he was behind his passed pawn, he could help it march forward. So now we have the pawn marching forward. Oh, one thing, if I go back, it looks like d5 would have been best to play here to get white to start marching his pawns forward, his passed pawn on the d file. So b4. King moving towards the center, the best move. b3. Black just keeps marching that pawn forward. The king moves over here to e4. That way, there won't be any possibility of moving this pawn to b2 and then moving the rook to check the king if the king was still on the f file, and that would give black time to march his pawn from b2 to b1, forcing the rook to capture, to knock out the pawn that would promote to a queen, and that would be a winning series of moves. So that's something to remember. Let's see, if we go back, with the pawn, or excuse me, the king on this f file, the threat is moving this pawn up to b2. and then swinging your rook over with check, giving the pawn time to go from b2 to b1 and promote. So always be aware of that in endgames, if that's a possibility. Threatening checks. So white takes care of king safety, jumping over here with these pawns where he cannot be checked by the rook. b2 just pushing that pawn forward, and now we have the king swinging up here, right into the center of the board where it can be better used to win the game. So black is running out of moves. He makes an inaccuracy here. Rook to king to g8. It looks like it would be better to just give up the b pawn by jumping over here. White would capture that pawn, of course, but black would be able to gain this pawn and then have another passed pawn on the g file. But in the game, the king was moved to g8, an inaccuracy. So we'll conclude this game here. White plays the best move, jumping his king up the board here, which will help him escort his pawns up the board. So the king tries to jump in here, and do what he can to stop this, but white starts marching forward. And it looks like rook to b8 immediately would have been the best move to check this king back over here to the g7 square. All right, so now we have the king just moving back anyway, running out of options. It looks like rook to e1 would have been better, going after this e pawn. And now the e pawn pushes forward. So we have the king moving to f8, the best move. But now the game is pretty much won here for white. So the conclusion was king to d7. King just moves back to g7. And white just keeps pushing his pawns here. So capture, the king comes down. But now white gets out of the way of his passed pawn where it can just march up the board. And so the game concluded with rook to e1, capture, capture. But now white swings back up here, protecting his e5 pawn. And there's a threat of, if black's king captures this g-pawn, well, this e-pawn can push forward with a discovered check by the rook on b5. And then possibly just keep pushing this pawn, or the king could jump over here and capture. There are just too many options for white. And so here the opponent resigned. And the game may have continued with rook to h4. The pawn would just push forward. Here, this was a threat of a discovered check by pushing this forward. But white is going to promote here. So capture of the pawn, the discovered check by the rook. Black swings down here with his passed pawn, but right now it's pinned to the king. So rook to a5. But at this point, it looks like there's a mate in 12 or even a mate in 7, depending on what black does. And this pawn is going to promote here. 2 passed pawns versus black's 1, which is pinned at the moment. All right, well, this game, if I take a look, it was a 15-minute game with 3-second increment. So perhaps in the future, it looks like they were both about out of time, 6 seconds and 4 seconds. All right, so in the future, maybe I'll do some more Queen's Gambit declined games so you can see how to play against that. But just remember, when you have rooks in the endgame, try and activate your rooks. Instead of playing defense with your rooks, I mean, sometimes you have to play defense, but if you have a good option of either defense or offense with your rooks, usually it's better to activate your rooks get them in an attacking position. So if we go back further into the game here, like in this position, we see that black's rook is just tied up here playing defense, whereas white's rook is more active. It can jump up and down this open c file. It could even move back and forth along the rank, moving in behind this unprotected pawn. So just remember, in rook endgames, usually the winner will be the person that activates their rooks and goes on the offensive with their rook or rooks. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Feel free to leave comments, suggestions, or even chess video requests. If there's something you would like to see, just leave a comment and request whatever you'd like to see, and I will try to work on that and get a video out for what you request. All right, thank you everyone, and have a great day.